I have a couple of different missions today. I think first one is I want to be the first 10-minute keynote to actually be done in 10 minutes. That'll be a score. Congratulations, Johan, for finishing your panel on time. We can get this thing going. For those who don't know me, my name's Mike Milinkovich, as introduced. I have the great privilege of being the executive director of the Eclipse Foundation, which is Europe's largest open source foundation. I happen to be Canadian, which today makes me feel a little intimidated because as a Canadian giving a talk in Europe, I feel I have some really tough acts to follow. So those who haven't watched my Prime Minister's talk on YouTube yet, I highly encourage you to do. I don't think I've been as proud of a Canadian Prime Minister on the world stage in about 40 years. So that's... So I mentioned we're the largest open source foundation in Europe. So we have open source projects in automotive, which is going to be a panel on later this afternoon. We also do a lot of work in data spaces. We do, of course, we have the traditional tool roots in developer tools. We also have a number of really interesting AI projects hosted at the Eclipse Foundation, I think all of which come from Europe, from places like CEA and Deutsche Telekom. And I think one of the things that I think is most interesting for this crowd is that we're also the home of the Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group, which is where we, with 20 other foundations and numerous manufacturers, are grappling with how the open source community is going to deal with the Cyber Resilience Act. I actually take a special pride in the fact that we've had 20 open source foundations, at least 20 open source foundations working with us. As far as I know, this is the largest collection of open source foundations collaborating together on anything in the history of the open source community, and I think we take the trust in the Eclipse Foundation that is implicit in that very seriously. And I would think the group had the Code and Compliance Day yesterday, and I think it was a real success. It's great to see them starting to produce useful artifacts that the Commission and the market surveillance authorities, the standard-setting organizations in Europe are all using as good inputs into as we roll forward with the implementation of the CRA. So now to the point of the talk, which is I want to talk a little bit about this notion of strategic autonomy. For various reasons, I actually like the label strategic autonomy a little bit better than digital sovereignty. I think of digital sovereignty as a subset of strategic autonomy, which is really about having the freedom of action to do what you need to do as a nation, or as in the case of the EU, a supranational organization. And of course, this is the policy summit, so it's a little bit biased sample, but I really find that there's a lot of focus on the public policy. Of course, it's the policy summit, I shouldn't be surprised. But I actually think of open source as very much an engineering and economic miracle. And I really want to talk a little bit about the kind of challenges that open source can help Europe with from an engineering and economic point of view. And amongst other things, I want to sort of put to bed the notion that Europe needs a Eurostack. Just saying it that way is sort of controversial, but what I think Europe actually needs is many Eurostacks. Because what Europe needs is not just Eurostack for cloud, in data, but also for automotive, for data spaces, possibly for defense. This notion of stacks being done in open source is something that we all do by nature in the open source community. And the idea that Europe would only ever want or need one stack, I think, is just just not right on. Now, in trying to organize my thoughts, of course, I started tailoring a layered architecture. I'm a reformed engineer. That's the way I'm going to think about it. But then I realized this is a policy audience as well, and maybe a layered architecture isn't the best way to explain it. And I remembered something that I studied many years ago, repeatedly actually, called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Everybody, put your hand up if you've ever heard of Maslow. Okay, good, all right. So it's basically a layered model that's used in psychology that explains sort of human desires and some definitions of human flourishing. It starts with the idea that before you can do anything else, you have to satisfy your physiological needs. If you can't eat, or if you're out of water, then you can't really think about other things. After that, you've got safety and security needs. Then after that, love and belonging. Then after you've got a good family life and hopefully love in your life, you can talk about self-esteem. And then at the very pinnacle is self-actualization. And the fundamental notion is you can't advance to the next step if you haven't satisfied the layer that you're on, right? And you can't really think about safety if you're starving. You'll do crazy things if you're starving. And actually, just as an aside, I think that really somewhat captures some of the rupture that we're all going through right now. Because as societies, a couple of months ago, we all thought we were at the esteem or self-actualization stage, and it turns out now if we don't belong to a rules-based international order, what do we belong to? And we're actually questioning our safety and security in ways that would have been confusing just months ago. But if you apply that to what Europe could use from a technological and economic point of view, and could in terms of open source and as you'll see, open hardware, what would Maslow's hierarchy of needs look like? And I think at the bottom, like physiological processors. All the work on the CHIPS JU and the CHIPS Act and so on, I think is well directed. I think that that's actually a good direction to head in. But I think that public money, public code could be applied somewhat more to that notion. Otherwise, it just risks turning into sort of industrial policy or industrial subsidy. And I don't think that's actually going to get the result that Europe wants. Then I think after you get that, the next one, safety and security in the personal level, I think we need to talk about supply chain resilience. And of course, the Cyber Resilience Act is working in that direction somewhat. But I think there's a lot of things that we could be doing for supply chain resilience for open source in Europe that haven't really been talked about too much. This morning, Aura was talking about the kill switch that relates to Microsoft technologies being used in public administrations. Does anybody not recognize the fact that pretty much every enterprise, public administration, and so on company in Europe is probably pulling from GitHub, Maven Central, NPM, et cetera, thousands of times every day? If there's a kill switch for Microsoft, there could be a kill switch for that too. So how are we going to deal with that in meaningful ways? I think the next level then, sovereign data. I think data spaces are a great idea. I think that there's a lot of work that can still be done to improve those. And I think that but that's really where digital sovereignty lives. And after you get to then, you can talk to some of the higher order things. And I think using open source as a competitiveness tool is really front and center, should be front and center in your policy making. I think that I had a call a couple of weeks ago and somebody from the commission said that they really look at open source through the lens of cybersecurity. And it kind of broke my heart because lately in Europe, it's all been about, amongst other things, the competitiveness agenda. And I think open source is absolutely a key tool for the future competitiveness of Europe. And if you're not thinking of open source in terms of an open innovation, open collaboration front and center in your competitiveness agenda, I think you're really missing the boat. And then finally, instead of self-actualization, I think disruptive innovation. And I think disruptive innovation is something that doesn't get talked about enough when we talk about open source in Europe, because open source is not just a tool, it's a weapon. And the Americans have gotten really good at disrupting incumbents and existing markets, creative destructive. But keep in mind, it wasn't the iPhone that killed BlackBerry, it was Android. And it wasn't AWS or Azure that made the cloud safe for the enterprises, it was Kubernetes. Right? So think about creative ways to use open source to disrupt the incumbents. Like just to throw out one example, I think if you want to invest in AI in Europe, what you should be doing is investing in how can we make AI ridiculously cheap, right? If you could do a frontier model on a laptop, then all the money that they've spent building on data centers all of a sudden becomes moot. And not only does that democratize the technology, it actually improves the sustainability and the green aspect of what we're going to be putting into power consumption for AI, if we could actually do that. I think that's a way more interesting, disruptive approach to AI than some of the things that I've heard so far. So I think that, it talks in terms of what does it actually mean to be a European stack? First and foremost, open source is a global community. And I've heard ideas about we should be writing all the code in Europe, and I think that's a crazy idea. You know, digital sovereignty happens by standing on the shoulders of giants, not reinventing the wheel. And I think that, so, you know, country of origin is a terrible idea. I think that we should be making sure that we have resilient supply chains and making sure that the projects that we use are open to European contribution. But those are the things that we should be focusing on. But a European stack is about European leadership, European governance, European innovation that's leading to build European skills, capacity, and prosperity. Because honestly, the world has never needed a prosperous, free Europe more than it needs it right now. Thank you.